Welcome to Into the Weeds. We have a bit of a full docket today, actually. There's a number of things going on that are of interest. One thing that is happening that we're just going to spend a minute on before we get started on our real topic today is the Epstein files. There have been some developments. You may have seen the protests that were happening on the Capitol steps. So we wanted to remind you that we did a video on the Epstein files back on July 30th, and it's still pertinent today. The analysis that we did, the explanation. So if you're wondering about what's going on with the Epstein files, go back and check out our current events Epstein files video from July 30th. Phil, you did want to say something about what's going on
Yeah,
today.
I just wanted to give people an idea of what's going on. So it wasn't really a protest at the Capitol steps, but some of the survivors, the Epstein survivors, were there. And it was very interesting. And some of you may not know these names, but there were three members of Congress. They're trying to pass something called the Epstein Transparency Files Act or something like that. And the people were Representative Massey, very conservative, sort of like libertarian um, Republican, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who you probably have heard of, and then Ro Khanna, who's a very progressive member of Congress, and they're all trying to get this bill passed that would allow the release of the that what are called the Epstein files, and that's what Jubal and I talked about before. But I wanted people to know what was going on just in terms of the process. In the House of Representatives, the majority party really controls everything that's happening. And so Speaker Johnson apparently doesn't want a vote on this bill, and Donald Trump doesn't want to vote on this bill. The problem is that a lot of Republicans had talked about this during the campaign. And so right now, all 212 Democrats are in favor of voting on this bill. Four Republicans have agreed to begin the process of getting this bill voted on. It's called a discharge petition. In order to bring a bill to the floor of the House to be debated and voted on against the wishes of the majority party, you need at least 218 signatures.
Hmm.
So right now there are 216. So if two more Republicans agree to sign the petition, then the bill would come to the floor and it would be debated on and voted on eventually. So there's a real struggle going on because Speaker Johnson and Donald Trump are trying to prevent anybody else from signing on. Um, and so we'll have to see how this plays out and whether it eventually gets a vote in the House of Representatives. For right now, it's still up in the air.
Right. So we'll probably end up doing another video then on Epstein as the issue matures. But for the time being, again, go back to our July 30th video, have a listen to what the debate is really all about, what the Epstein files are, and ultimately Phil and I's position on whether or not it's a good idea to release them en masse to the public. That said, today's topic, we're going to be talking about something called a pocket rescission, which is something that probably not a lot of people have heard about. This is something that has been reported, but it hasn't been broadly talked about. You're not seeing it uh, um, uh, swirling around social media or anything like that. But it is something that applies directly to the authoritarian series that Phil and I did, which was basically a collection of warning flags, things that you should be concerned about if you see them happen. And this specific thing has to do with something called impoundment, which I will let Phil explain in a little bit greater detail. But it's also something that we address in video 9 of our authoritarian series. So if you are interested in pocket rescissions, if it's something that you have heard of and you don't really understand it, I would recommend that you go back and you watch video 9 of our authoritarian series. And then I'm going to kick it to Phil now and let him talk a little bit about what this actually means, and then we'll get into it.
Okay, so thank you for the intro, and definitely go back and look at what we talked about before if some of this doesn't make sense. And it's hard to talk about this because some of the language is just complicated, and but it winds up being, I think, really significant. So let's start off with talking about sort of first how a bill becomes a law and sort of the standard process. So in a normal world, when Congress passes a bill and then the president signs the bill into law, the money that's included in the bill, if it includes any money, has to be spent within a certain amount of time. Now, back in the day, and we talk about this in more detail in the other video, there was a point in which Richard Nixon was going ahead and Congress would pass a bill that allocated money, and he simply refused to spend it because he disagreed with the policy, thought it was unwise for whatever reason. And so eventually, in response to that, the Impoundment Control Act was passed. And the way the and so this is 1974, and this is the way it's been done ever since. Is and that the way it works is that if, let's say, Congress passes a bill, the bill includes money that the president disagrees with it. Maybe it's money for foreign aid or climate change mitigation or housing assistance or whatever. According to the Impoundment Control Act, what the president is allowed to do is, even though Congress signed it, passed it, even though the president signed it into law or a former president signed it into law, the president can propose canceling the money. That's what a rescission is, right? But under the law, under the Impoundment Control Act, what happens is Congress gets the final say. So the president looks at a particular bill, says, I think this is a waste of money, or I think this is bad policy. He sends the rescission back to Congress. Congress gets the rescission, the proposed cutting of funding that's already been passed. If Congress agrees with it, then they can vote again and say, yeah, you're right, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't spend this money. But the way they wrote the Impoundment Control Act was that if Congress doesn't have to vote again, they've already voted to allocate the money, right? That if after 45 days, if Congress just ignores it and says whatever, after 45 days, the law requires that the money be spent. Okay, and so that's what the law is, and that's where this pocket rescission comes in.
So
It's kind of a,
my understanding, real
go
quick, my
ahead.
understanding is that prior to the Impoundment Control Act, that it was essentially the reverse of that. And again, in our previous video, we talk about this, but it used to be that if the president impounded the funds, Congress had to vote to release them. And now it is, if the president impounds the funds, Congress doesn't have to do anything. If they do
Right.
nothing at all, then eventually the president will be compelled to spend the money, right? So the default setting
Right.
is that the money has to be spent. Is that
Yeah,
right?
no, I don't know if it was a case that prior to that point, the Congress would have to vote to rescind it. I don't think that's the case. It's just that presidents um, didn't do what Nixon was doing. What Nixon was doing was something unusual. And
Mhm.
so the Impoundment Control Act was Congress's response to a unique sort of threat
Specifically to Nixon. It was
to
specifically to
Nixon.
Nixon.
Yes, Nixon, but more significantly in terms of the institution, as we talk about in the video, Congress controls the power of the purse. That's the power
Right.
that the framers gave Congress to allocate money. And so it was, yes, Nixon was president. It was really a threat to one of the formidable powers that Congress possesses
Mhm.
by virtue of Article 1. And
So
so that's
what is it that makes the pocket rescission unique?
right. Okay, great. So thank you. So here's how a pocket rescission works. So imagine Congress passes a bill that includes $500 million for disaster relief. And according to the bill, this money has to be spent by September 30th. That's the end of the fiscal year. And so any money not allocated by or spent by September 30th, the authorization to spend it goes away because the fiscal year is over. So the president doesn't like this particular bill. Maybe he thinks it's wasteful, whatever. So instead of going ahead and challenging Congress head on, what he does is he waits until August, right as Congress is on recess. And as you guys have probably been seeing on TV, Congress just came back, but they were on recess for most of August, where they were holding town hall meetings, going back, talking to their constituents. So what the president does is he waits till Congress isn't in session, and then he submits the rescission request. Now, the way the Impoundment Control Act works, the clock, that 45-minute day, that
Days.
45-day clock doesn't start ticking until Congress comes back into session. So Congress has been out of session, they come back, the president has submitted this rescission, but the clock doesn't start ticking then. Congress gets back, they have other things they have to do, so they don't get around to this, and the fiscal year ends, and the bill, the money dies because Congress doesn't.
Expires,
Yeah,
essentially
it just
expires.
expires. The authorization expires, and so um, this is the use of the pocket rescission. It's like playing a timing game.
Hmm.
Um, it's about sort of not not engaging Congress on the spending of money. It's using the clock to sort of run out the clock, and this is deeply problematic. And that's what makes it controversial.
Right. So a couple things.
Mhm.
The thing that is included in the pocket rescission is about $5 billion in spending for USAID, is my understanding. Correct me if I'm
Right.
wrong. That's going to various projects that are involved with that agency. And so, unless Congress gets together and votes against the rescission at some point within the next 3 weeks, that funding is going to go away, right?
Correct.
That's gonna disappear. So I think where Phil and I will agree here, and I think where anybody who looks at this issue and tries to understand it will agree, is that what the president is doing is against the intent of the Impoundment Control Act. And also, again, correct me if I'm wrong, the GAO has mentioned this before. The Government
Yeah.
Accountability Office has said multiple times, if I'm not mistaken, that this is a loophole that needs to be closed, that and only Congress can close it, right? So it hasn't been closed. The loophole is still there because there's no specific language that speaks to a rescission that overlaps with the end of the fiscal year, right? So I would say just, and this is as somebody who for the most part supports a lot of Trump policies, um, that this is pretty gross. This is a dirty trick. It reminds me of kind of the stuff that's going on between Texas and California right now with the redistricting. Like it's not illegal because it isn't against the text of the law, but it is clearly against the intent of the law. And that's my take on it. What is your take on it, Phil?
Mm, I agree with you completely on that, but I think it speaks to a bigger pattern, and this is where we might disagree. But this also goes back to our previous recordings when we talked about the movement towards authoritarianism. So, for those of you the 22 of you who've watched some of our videos, as you might recall, we talked about this book called How Democracies Die. And what the authors do is they make this very compelling argument that authoritarianism in the modern age doesn't usually arrive as like tanks rolling out into the streets. It creeps in through legal loopholes and technicalities where elected leaders stay within the letter of the law but completely violate its spirit.
Mhm.
And one of their central warnings in How Democracies Die is the erosion, and Jubal and I talked about this in length, the erosion of what they call institutional forbearance, that basic understanding that leaders could push the limits of their authority, but they choose not to do so normally, not because the Constitution stops them, not because the law stops them, but because democracy depends on restraint. And to me, that's where pocket rescissions matter. That's where they come in. It might look like boring budget mechanics, just a president delaying the release of funds, but in reality, they represent a very deliberate choice on the part of the Trump administration to ignore Congress's power of the purse. This is a central power given to Congress, right? The framers quite consciously gave it to him. So the president isn't asking Congress to change the law. He's not vetoing the law, which would the law that um, allocated the money, because this has already been allocated. But if he vetoed a law, Congress have the ability to override it. He's waiting out the clock so that the authorization of the money expires. It's a move that's, like Jubal has said, it may be technically legal or it's not explicitly illegal. The courts haven't ruled on this yet, and maybe they will, but it undermines the foundation of democratic accountability. So I want to just get away from the idea that this is just sort of a budgeting thing. I think, to me, and this is where Jubal and I almost certainly disagree, I see it as a part of a broader pattern, because we've seen the Trump administration reassign and fire watchdogs who investigate executive abuse. These are the inspectors generals. We've seen the Justice Department go after political critics, including Republican critics. We've seen efforts to punish states and cities that oppose federal policy. All of this adds up to a governing style that, to me, favors power over process. It rewards loyalty over adherence to the law. So pocket rescissions aren't going to grab a lot of headlines the way a Supreme Court case might. But I think it's part of a broader pattern that has led me to believe that we are, in fact, moving in a more authoritarian direction. This is just another one pieces of the puzzle. So
Hmm.
I see it as I think I see in the micro sense, I see it the way Jubal does. In the macro sense, I see something different and something far more concerning and threatening.
Hmm. I mean, I understand that's part of the, you know, the matrix of authoritarianism that you see from this administration, and as we talked about in our series on authoritarianism, whether or not an administration is authoritarian is something that can be measured, and but it also is not necessarily, and I know it sounds weird, it's not necessarily always a negative thing. uh, what authoritarianism means is that the executive branch is gaining power. Now, as a rule, you and I both agree, and I think most people would agree, that investing more power into the executive branch is not what this government needs, right? And so I tend to side with you. I tend to agree with you on the idea that this is not really a good idea. But do keep in mind a couple of things. I would say just a couple of things. First, this is an inconsequential amount of money, right? This is a tiny amount of money, and in a lot of ways, I think this has become a tempest in a teacup for you, right? This is like, it's $5 billion represents a tiny fraction of a fraction of the budget. Granted, this was a nasty way to prevent that expenditure. However, if you recall from the work that Doge had done in uncovering the things that were happening in USA, a lot of these programs are things that did not have broad support from the American people. Now, the USA did some good things, but there was a lot of really hinky stuff in there too. And this $5 billion represents, again, my understanding, a good portion of that strange stuff that the broad majority of American people did not want to support. For instance, the funding of a trans-centric opera in El Salvador. You want to do that? That's fine. Like, I'm not against a trans opera in El Salvador. That's great. I just don't know why I have to pay for it, right? Because I'll bet you I'm not going to get a percentage of the door, right? I'm not going to see anything from the profits that opera generates. So why do I have to invest in it? I think that's kind of the question that a lot of the programs in the USA bin that people were asking. So on the one hand, I don't agree with the methodology. I don't agree with the tactic. I don't agree with the technique. On the other hand, he kind of is doing something that the broad majority of the American people want, in the sense that he's getting a handle on that kind of spending. Doesn't justify it, but it does kind of explain it maybe a little bit.
Yeah,
Uh,
and to me, whether or not the American people support it or don't support it is not the issue.
mhm.
Process is important in a democracy. Process is important. And so there are ways to get things done and ways not to get things done. And so if the majority of people want to support denying funds for certain programs, I think that's fine. Go make your case to Congress and
Mhm.
let them vote on it. But don't use, but don't violate the
Underhanded,
spirit.
underhanded tricks.
Right. And it's and what makes it underhanded is Congress has no ability to respond. And if you go again back to our videos, we talked about something called presidential signing statements. And I
Mhm.
talked about something called what that I call very controversial signing statements, where a president basically disregards a law or tells the executive branch to disregard a law. And what makes them particularly problematic is Congress has no ability to respond.
I,
This
I
is the
would
same.
so I would
Go ahead.
disagree in this sense. I would disagree in this sense on this particular issue, because the rescission is on the desk of the speaker. This is something that Congress could act on. My guess is that they won't. I would think, as you said, they have more important things to deal with right now, and I think that the majority of people in Congress really don't want this spending to go through. However, I will make a prediction, and maybe you can make a prediction as well. I will predict that this eventually will go to the courts, because if it does happen in the way that I think we're both anticipating that Congress is not going to act on the rescission, which means the spending will be killed, right? So the programs will not be funded. But that will eventually go to court, and the court will find against this administration,
Yeah,
because it's so clearly against the intent of the ICA, the Impoundment Control Act. So clearly, this pocket rescission is against the intent of the law, that I can't fathom a court finding in favor of this administration. So maybe at the end of the day, the good news, the silver lining, is that the loophole will finally be closed, right?
right. And sort of as you're saying, the ideal solution would be that Congress closes the
Actually
loophole. And same
votes,
in
right,
right, right.
right, and
That's
then
how it
closes the
should be
loophole.
done.
Yeah, that's how it should be done.
Right, right. Ideally, so in theory, the courts can do it, but it would be better that there was a legislative response to that. The problem with that right now is that the legislature doesn't seem to want to do anything that isn't supportive of Donald Trump, and so I don't see them doing that. I'm not sure how the courts will rule, quite frankly. Um, uh, in particular, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court seems to be um, supportive of this sort of idea of a unitary executive. I see that as like a fundamentally anti, or like non-conservative position. It blows me away when I see conservatives supporting concentrated power in the executive branch. It's always weird. When I see libertarians supporting that, it's always really weird to me. It's something we typically associate with Democrats. But this Supreme Court seems to be particularly persuaded by this notion of a unitary executive. So I'm not as convinced as Jubal that they would rule against the administration. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, we'll have to see what comes of it. It is something that's worth tracking, I think. And even though I don't necessarily agree with the authoritarian pastiche that you've put together, Phil, for this administration, I do agree that it's concerning. I do agree that tricks like this are not cool, and you know you're trying to pull a fast one, and it's not cool. So there are better ways to do it. Anything else you want to say in closing?
No, that's it.
That's
That's
pretty
it.
much it. So
Thank you
we
for
may,
listening.
yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. We may talk about this one again. Almost certainly, we're going to talk about the Epstein files again, too. So make sure you go back, watch the Epstein files video from July 30th, watch episode 9 of our authoritarian series to understand more about pocket rescissions. Thanks,
And if you
everybody.
have any topics that you think would be good for us to cover, be sure to let us know in the comments.
Yeah, comment, subscribe, click all the buttons, please. And we'll see you next time around. Take care.
Take care, everybody.